Welcome back to History on a Hog. I'm Captain Boz. I'm on the road to find the missing Le Sol Blanc, or the Whitebird, which mysteriously disappeared in 1927. In Part 2, we learned that the Whitebird was a specially built French biplane that was designed to compete for the first non-stop transatlantic flight between Paris and New York City, and claimed the highly touted Orteig Prize. With two famous World War I French fighter aces at the controls, Charles Lindbergh and François Colli, this aircraft was the French entry into this great intercontinental race. Their main competition was an American air mail pilot, Charles Lindbergh, who would attempt the feat in the reverse direction, New York to Paris, with the Spirit of St. Louis. We also learned that on May 8, 1927, Lindbergh, Colli, and the Whitebird departed Le Bourget Field in Paris 2 weeks ahead of Lindbergh. They were aware of numerous earlier attempts by other American teams looking to be the first and claim the Orteig Prize. So they were extremely pleased to get off the ground when they did on this great race and get a head start on the Spirit of St. Louis and Charles Lindbergh. The crew was confident in their plan to cross the sea in 40 hours and then make a spectacular water landing at the base of the Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor in front of thousands of cheering spectators. But they never made it, and they and their aircraft, Le Sol Blanc, disappeared with no trace, and they have been missing ever since. So, what happened to the Whitebird? Some say she crashed into the ocean. Others say she crashed into the bogs of Newfoundland. And then there are other witnesses who say she crashed in northern, down east Maine, near Machias. But before we move on, I wanted to clear up a major misconception that many people seem to have about Charles Lindbergh's successful flight. That being that he was the first pilot to cross the Atlantic Ocean in an airplane. This is incorrect. By the year of his flight in 1927, crossing the Atlantic by airplanes had already been successfully accomplished by several individuals and groups, beginning in 1919. But these successful flights required many refueling stops via major logistical bases along the way, a huge and expensive undertaking. The significance of Lindbergh's flight was he would be the first to complete the first non-stop flight from New York to Paris. And he did it relatively cheaply, on a single tank of gas, across the Atlantic without stopping. That's the significance of what he did. And his flight would soon show the practicality of a transatlantic flight and inaugurate the era of intercontinental flights between America and Europe. So who did make the first transatlantic flight? And when was it? Well, it had been successfully completed by a mixed U.S. Navy and U.S. Coast Guard flight crew, flying a new type of seaplane in May of 1919, 8 years before Lindbergh's flight in 1927. Their mammoth seaplane, known as the NC-4, left Rockaway Beach in Queens, New York on May 14, 1919, which is over 100 years ago. And after 7 refueling stops, beginning at Cape Cod, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, and the Azores, they arrived in Lisbon, Portugal on May 27, 1919, to boisterous and exuberant crowds in the harbor. And as a point of personal pride, the pilot at the controls at the time of the landing was the only Coast Guard aviator on board, Lieutenant Elmer Stone. In fact, at this time in history, he was the only Coast Guard pilot, period, anywhere, designated as Coast Guard Aviator number 1. For comparison purposes, my Coast Guard aviator number is 2,923. Semper Paratus. They would eventually continue the flight and make their final landing at Plymouth, England on May 29, 1919. Today, the original NC-4 can be viewed at the U.S. Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, Florida, and it's definitely worth the trip to see her. So winning the Orteig Prize, which was what the Whitebird was competing for, was a completely different first flight. They were not competing to be the first across the Atlantic. That had already been accomplished by the NC-4. They were competing to be the first non-stop flight across the Atlantic from New York to Paris, or vice versa. The Orteig Prize would motivate considerable investment in aviation, sometimes many times the value of the prize itself. It was offered not only to advance aviation technology and airplane reliability for long-distance flights, but it was intended to increase public awareness in the advances in aviation technology and safety, so as to entice international visitors to New York City, and more specifically, to Raymond Orteig's hotel. So really, it was only a publicity stunt. The first serious attempt on the prize was made in 1926 by a team led by French flying ace René Fonck and backed by Igor Sikorsky, the aircraft designer. Sikorsky, who put $100,000 of his own money towards the attempt, built an aircraft, the S-35, for the specific purpose of winning the Orteig Prize. As you might imagine, the first successful airplane design to accomplish this feat would be in great demand, and Sikorsky hoped that his winning airplane design would make him and his company very rich. It's the old saying, greed is good, and it is the mother's milk of invention. In September of 1926, Sikorsky and Fonck were ready for the attempt. With 3 crewmen aboard to assist him, Fonck opened the throttles up and made his way down the runway. However, the aircraft was hopelessly overloaded with people, supplies, and most especially, fuel. A lot of fuel for those 3 engines that were installed. The takeoff roll was taking way too long, and as the runway ended, Fonck tried to raise the nose of the aircraft, but it was moving too slow, and at the end of the runway, it crashed and burned. The aircraft was completely destroyed. Fonck and his co-pilot, Curtin, survived the crash, but the other 2 crewmen, Clavier and Islamov, were killed. Team Sikorsky had failed in its attempt before it really had a chance to start. But by 1927, things began moving fast and furious, with 3 groups in the United States and 1 in Europe preparing attempts on the prize. From the United States, there was the first group, made up of famed polar explorer Richard E. Byrd, with Floyd Bennett and George Norville as crew, financially backed by Rodman Wanamaker. They had a German-designed aircraft built for them, a trimotor named America, from the great German airplane designer Anthony Fokker. The second group was made up of aviators Clarence Chamberlain and Bert Acosta, financially backed by Charlie Levine. They had planned an attempt in a Belanca aircraft named Columbia. And a third team, made up of Stanton Worcester and Noel Davis, were preparing the attempt using a Keystone Pathfinder aircraft named American Legion. And in France, the lone European team was busily building their specially designed aircraft. With numerous private and governmental financial backers, the team of Charles Nungesser and François Colli were preparing for their east-west crossing in the Levasseur Whitebird. The French company Levasseur had agreed to build him a new biplane with government backing. It had a wooden boat-like fuselage, so it could land in calm water. It was roughly 31 feet from end to end, with a massive engine and propeller. When the airplane was completed in April of 1927, it was painted white so that it would be easier to find if the pilots crashed. Then Nungesser added a personal touch. He painted his old fighter squadron emblem, a skull and crossbones with a coffin and 2 candles, all inside a black heart, on the fuselage, supposedly for good luck. And of course, there was the 5th team, Charles Lindbergh's team, who was busily building the Spirit of St. Louis in San Diego. But he hadn't announced his intentions to enter the Orteig race until very late in 1927. You'll find out what happens to those other flight teams that were racing against the Whitebird when you return for Part 4. And we'll take a detailed look at the flight route of the Whitebird, from their celebrated takeoff until their mysterious disappearance. Next time on History on a Hawk.